any adjustments or position that doesn't cause any inflammatory response is that 90-degree position.
There's a few of the claims made in your videos. The very last actual post is where most of these come from on your Instagram. So one of the little captions or little pop-ups, I don't know how to do those on my own Insta. I'm not that TikTok savvy. But it says that 90-degree stopping presses of various kinds at 90 degrees is better for the joints. And I'd be very curious to see how you have arrived at that position.
Okay. Yeah. Before I answer that, I just want to say I actually have great respect for everything you do, because I've seen a lot of people post like, "Hey, Mike, like jump in." And you're always very, very civil the way you handle yourself, very similar to Ben Patrick. So I really appreciate that, because there's a lot of professionals in the field, and we can disagree and all that stuff, but there are some people who just go off bashing the daylights out of people, calling people out, and you don't do that. So great respect and admiration.
Thank you so much
for what you do. So even though we may have different views, I love what you do, man. So so one of the things there, so first off with the captions, like you have 2 seconds to catch people's attention. So yes, some of that is like, hey, I can't give a ton of context because it's Instagram, right? Okay, so it doesn't give me a chance to fully explain everything. I have to put up kind of like the quick thing that's going to get people's attention. And it's not that I don't believe it. I do. But like you said, I think there's some context behind that. Correct me if I'm wrong. You are more in the bodybuilding side of things a little bit. Would you, to an extent?
So my own personal pursuit in training is bodybuilding. It would be comical if I did anything else looking like this. But actually, I'm a tennis player. I'm like, oh, okay. But I also compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I do that regularly. I used to be a wrestler, and I powerlifted highly unsuccessfully for a long time. I've also coached a bunch of actual real athletes, like volleyball players and basketball players and strength and conditioning. So I have some background, but yeah, mostly I just do highly unathletic jiu-jitsu and bodybuilding, which is entirely unathletic.
Yeah, nice. Very cool. So one of the things is like for that post, that was with he's a quarterback, Taylor Heineke. So I was using him specifically because he's had shoulder issues mainly from when he fell on it. He separated his shoulder. And so this is just an example. He could not do any type of chest pressing unless it was, and I mean, this is literally directly from his mouth when we'd be working out. Like he'd be saying like, man, if I go even like this much past 90, it hurts. Like it hurts bad. If I stay right there in that range, it feels totally fine. Now that's an extreme example because he had a separated shoulder and some very high impact and trauma in there. But I have noticed this trend in other individuals, people who've come in with shoulder issues, or maybe even people that were, apparently healthy. But I've seen where oftentimes that full range of motion becomes a problem. And over time, the position that doesn't require any, adjustments, or the position that doesn't cause any inflammatory response is that 90-degree position. And again, I would argue it's because that's where we have maximal motor unit recruitment, maximal cross bridging. So our ability to absorb force and keep tension off the joints is going to be best. So that's kind of my rationale for that.
We've all heard that to get optimal sleep, you should cool your room down to 68 to 69 degrees. But that's not all you need to do. And that's why we've partnered with 8 Sleep mattresses. Now they have the Pod Pro and the Pod Pro Cover. And the amazing technology of this mattress allows you to cool the mattress down to 55 degrees or to have it as warm as 110 degrees. But the great thing is that the temperature changes through the night based off of your actual body temperature to make sure that you get the most restful sleep possible. You fall asleep 32% faster and you move around 40% less when you're actually asleep. It's amazing. And Andrew, how can people get it?
Yeah, this is amazing technology that actually changes its temperature based off of your sleep cycle. There's no other technology like it anywhere else. To take advantage of this, head over to 8sleep.com/power project. That's EIGHT sleep.com/power project. And you guys will receive $150 off this amazing technology. Links to them down in the description below. Let's get back to this video.
And so a lot of physical therapists, and this is kind of a position stand in most of the associations now, is they say like probably the first thing you want to do after injury initial recovery occurs is try to expand the range of motion to as much of normal physiological range. And also sort of an offshoot of that in the study of mobility and sport performance, a lot of those experts tend to think that mobility, which is flexibility plus strength, like your ability to exert strength through the fullest range of motion possible, is kind of the cornerstone of athletic development. So do you see yourself deviating from that sort of mainstream position for the reasons you've kind of experienced in your clinical practice? Or do you think maybe that has some merit, or there's maybe some middle ground there? What do you think about that?
I think there's definitely some middle ground there because, for example, I can just give you almost verbatim what I did with, I'll go back to Taylor because this is the post that we're talking about. He separated his shoulder. This is in the game playoffs against Tampa Bay last year. He fell on it, dived into the end zone. So he came back 9 days later, and range of motion was definitely a thing that, like, hey, we had to get that back. It's not like, oh, like, let's keep the joint immobile and create as much tension as possible. It's like, no. Like, let's get what I would consider full range of motion. One of the exercises that I had him do was a dumbbell pullover, right? Laying on his back on a bench and doing a pullover. And I believe the natural or optimal range of motion for that is actually a pretty large range of motion where he's going all the way back, stretching that. And we gradually open that up. Same thing with overhead movements, taking them all the way. Because at first, he came in as like, oh man, that hurts. Gradually, really worked on keeping the shoulders back a little farther, started opening up. So it's not that I'm opposed to range of motion. I think, like you said, there's a lot of common middle ground there. I think there are certain positions, especially when we start loading it, where I would say that going too far beyond 90 is not as optimal. But, there are probably scenarios where people go past that and they would be just fine. So it's not necessarily that I'm against range of motion. I think it comes down to the position, but generally 90 degrees, I would argue, is kind of where that optimal range of motion is under loaded conditions or high load, high impact scenarios.
And that's kind of based on your clinical experience, I guess. The actual
definitely clinical experience. And then just, like we said, we went back and forth on some of the science because there's flip sides to every side of the science. As you know, you have whether it's, the ketone diet, the paleo diet, whether anything we talk about in the sports industry, there's always two sides of it. One side says this, the other side says this. So I think you can look at the research, and there's probably research supporting both sides, what you're saying and maybe what I'm saying. But I think what helped me kind of apply what I have seen and believe in it more is just what I've seen experientially at that point and anecdotally just from working with athletes.
Mm-hmm. And then when folks come to your account and they're trying to look for tips, do you think it's good for them to think of it in the context of like, okay, if I'm injured or I have a history of these sorts of problems, maybe I should limit my range of motion? Or do you think everyone, for the most part, as a default, should stick to kind of the 90-degree thing and not really go any lower than that?
On something like on a bench press, I think they do need to be careful. On other exercises, even, if they want to do like certain shoulder mobility exercises that are unloaded, those, I think that's a little bit more of a gray zone. I think there will be a lot of drills in there that probably would be helpful for folks, especially after an injury, just help to kind of like even neuromuscularly, like just get rid of some of those inhibition signals so they can start opening up their movement. But under the loaded conditions, that's where I'm talking a bit more specifically about, especially something like the bench press, which for a lot of folks just causes issues. And, a lot of individuals have pain, a lot of inflammation when they do the bench press. And I think it as a result, a lot of folks stop doing the bench press. They say, hey, I can't do it anymore because it hurts. To me, I think everyone can do a bench press if they do it properly, good shoulder and elbow position. And I have found that the 90-degree position allows them to do it most safely and pain-free in my experience.
Part of the reason for the success of the slingshot is because bench pressing can wreak havoc on some people.
Yeah.
Right. What do you think of this position has been, I think, very well explained recently by a gentleman that goes by the name of knees over toes guy.
Oh, yes.
And that's a hilarious thing to just tack your name to, but I think makes some good points. And I think one of his points is that, athletes that get into extreme ranges of motion and learn to slowly and carefully produce tension in those ranges can actually, to a large extent, insulate themselves from injury risk. And think about something like a sport like Nsima does, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. An athlete like him, he's in positions that are just really not all that fun and extreme ranges of motion, inverting with your legs behind your head, getting your arms sort of broken off this way and that, And if they don't practice in those extreme ranges, there's some very good rationale to say like their actual rates of injury in those ranges that they will encounter in sport for sure, whether they like it or not, is going to be higher. So what do you think about the idea that maybe if we prepare athletes gingerly, carefully, methodically to expand their ranges of motion until they can get into really extreme ranges and still produce force? What do you think about the idea that Knees Over Toes guy, for example, is a good proponent of, that we actually reduce the injury risk by getting into those ranges comfortably and slowly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if you saw this earlier. I was mentioning, we were briefly talking about Knees Over Toes guys. I was saying that he and I actually agree on a lot more than what we disagree on. So I think the one area that, and you just called it out, is the range of motion component that we probably have differing views on. A few things that I would say that one of the keys to making sure that an individual who maybe goes through more extreme range of motion, like a martial arts sport or jujitsu, or maybe even, dancers or rock climbers, it's another one, wrestlers. One of the keys that I always say is, hey, you just got to practice your sport. Okay, that's one of the best ways to keep that sport specificity, that range of motion for that sport. So I'm not saying, hey, don't even practice your sport like that. But in my opinion, one of the best ways to prepare the body for that sport is actually practicing that sport. And if it requires larger range of motion, then when they're practicing that sport, I think they obviously need to get into it. They need to be prepared for it. One of the things I would also say is that people have been getting into extreme range of motion in their respective sports for decades, centuries actually, or millennia. And it was well before the dawn of the fitness industry ever came about. So it's not like we needed deep end range strength training or deep end range fitness training to get people to be able to perform deeper positions in their sports. People have been able to get into those positions for years. And I would actually argue that the ability of individuals to get into these extreme positions now is worse than it's ever been, even though we've been emphasizing this so much. So I would say that one of the best ways to make sure individuals are ready for extreme positions is make sure the muscles and the tissues are healthy in general. They're not inflamed. The muscles are able to absorb force, so that if they are caught off guard and have to get into a more extreme position, their muscles are healthy. Their tissues are healthy. They're not inflamed. Their body's not sending inhibitory signals because there's so much pain and discomfort. It's like if somebody gets put in like an arm position where, again, I'm not a martial arts expert, but if they get put into a certain position and that shoulder has been, inflamed and tight from just, doing excessive range of motion, maybe like on bench press for some reason. Okay. If they get put in that position, their body's probably going to shut it down even more. They're going to have no strength there. Whereas if the tissues are healthy and they get put in that position, they'll probably have better ability to absorb force. But I also understand what you're saying. It's like, hey, we're not talking about doing so much training in that position where it produces inflammation. So, but again, I would argue that humans have been able to do these extreme positions well before the fitness era or end range training ever came about. The training that I do does not take that ability, that innate, inherent ability away from them. We're just adding to that by giving them a therapeutic stimulus to make sure their muscles are stronger and more resilient.
Do you consider your training therapeutic and not ergogenic then?
I would consider it to be both.
Okay. Interesting. And then, another claim real quick. You're claiming in a few of these videos that 90 degrees is better for muscle growth. Mm-hmm. There's like a pretty decent volume of literature now that directly examines full range of motion versus partial, and the full wins almost every time. Right. There's also a considerable amount of literature on the fact that muscles, when they produce tension while being stretched, actually yield a bigger hypertrophy response than if muscles that produce an even larger amount of external load when they're not stretched. Do you think that still confers some sort of advantage to 90 degrees? Because to me, it seems like if I were just analyzing, I'd say, a very deep stretch seems to grow more muscle. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say the stretch with tension is, in fact, in my opinion, it's not just overload, but like you said, stretch with tension is probably the most important factor for stimulating the hypertrophy response. So I'm not opposed to stretch. I'm just opposed to excessive stretch. Because what I'm saying is that when you do a proper 90-degree position, the muscles are actually very stretched. Biomechanically, it may look, or visually, it may not look that deep, but the muscle fibers themselves are really lengthened because we're creating so much active tension. And, I'll try to adjust the screen here just for a second, but I think Mark, you mentioned this a little bit on the bench press. If someone is doing a bench press and their shoulders are internally rotated, to get any semblance of stretch in their chest, they're going to have to keep going down and down and down and down. And finally, they may actually start to get some stretch in their pectoral fibers. But if they know how to set their back, open everything up, then, by the time they're 90, in my opinion, if they're actually keeping everything fully engaged, their muscles will be maximally stretched at 90. They won't be able to go deeper unless they lose tension. So again, I'm all for the stretch. It's simply that there's a point, and I think everyone would agree that there is such a thing as too much stretch, because if we just said, hey, stretch until you can't go anymore, we would say, stretch before the muscle rips off the bone. We know that's not optimal. So there has to be some happy medium there. And I believe the balance of that point is at 90.
That's a fair point. I mean, we kind of see this like when we're doing an exercise like a row. Some people will say, hey, pitch those elbows back as far as you could possibly get them. And now we're kind of hearing some other folks saying maybe there's a slightly different way of doing them. Maybe you can just kind of drive the elbows down and kind of do that reverse shrug type movement, and you can help load the lats. Interesting points. I think you guys going back and forth here, and I think this is really helpful. Do you have another question, Mike?
One more.
Go for it.
So a lot of the exercises you're exhibiting are what we would call in sports science unstable training. So essentially, it's intentionally generated to be the exercise is intentionally designed to be unstable. And what we found in unstable training in the research literature is that it fails to produce very high forces. Because of a lack of stability, high force production doesn't occur. So we kind of have this bifurcation in training where if you're going to be unstable, it might as well be in the techniques of your sport. So for example, if Nsima is practicing not getting swept, it's going to be super unstable because it's part of his technique. But when he wants to load his hips and his chest and everything to be stronger for jiu-jitsu, it seems like the specificity principle should dictate that he gets real stable on like a proper bench press. And then with maximum stability can exert maximum amounts of force. So he's training a high force production in the gym, which is kind of what the gym is supposed to be for. And then, like to your earlier point, the athlete does the athlete stuff and goes through all these ranges of motion and all the stability stuff. So when I see the unstable training that you're doing, my first question is kind of like, if they got more stable, wouldn't their muscles get stronger? And then we could take that new strength and put it into the sport. Because so for example, if I see a grappler that I have to go up against, and he benches 315 on like a wobbly situation, kind of halfway up and down, but this is a scary guy. It takes a lot of strength to do that. But if I see a guy sink 400 plus 500 in a stable bench with a lot of power, I'm like, that guy's gonna fucking kill me, and I don't want any part of that. So, isn't it better to maybe get more strength when strength is optimal? Another quick example is like if it was raining on your head, if the sun was shining really bright, you wouldn't be able to lift as hard. So we have gyms with ceilings and air conditioning, so that doesn't happen. So, and then, it'd also be much harder if the music was blaring or you hated the music, or someone was, yelling at you at 3 a.m. and you didn't go to sleep. And then it'd be like, well, it's kind of a different challenge. Well, yeah, that's a different challenge. You end up lifting less, and that challenge is less because it challenges your actual muscles and tendons less to get stronger. So don't we want to be kind of at our best foot forward, real stable and strong with barbells and dumbbells, so that when we get real strong, we can transition to exhibiting that strength in that athletic context of sport? What do you think about that?
Those are great questions. First off, you're analyzing it way deeper and more scientifically than most people do. So I like that. Because oftentimes people just like ask the questions like, dude, are you even thinking about how you're phrasing it? So I like that. I think, so just real quick on that, when you said, if you saw, someone benching 315 unstable, like, some crazy instability variation, maybe hanging band or a ball, and then you saw another guy doing, 500 for a few reps, like obviously the guy who's doing the 500, that's like, oh man, this guy can probably pack a lot of force. Personally, I would be more scared of the guy who can do both. So my argument would be not to do one or the other, to have the capability to do both. But I would also say that, being able to do 500 and doing that on a more frequent basis is more important than the 315, but periodically incorporating the unstable variation. So one thing that probably goes a little bit more unnoticed.
Are those videos on your Instagram of your guys benching and squatting to depth and deadlifting super heavy loads real stable? Because I think most, if not all of your videos seem to have some kind of instability component.
Yeah. So one of the things I always say, and I need to do a better job of this on Instagram, is 80% of everything I have my athletes do, everything that I do, it focuses on the foundational movements. Okay. Now, I say this a lot, and when I post exercises, I do intentionally oftentimes go after exercises that are a little bit more eye-catching, because I know that for me to reach the most population, the largest portion of the audience, okay, and to make the biggest impact, okay, because that's ultimately what I'm trying to do, is how do I get people to notice things, read a little bit more, and to, basically take a look at what I'm doing. If I just posted deadlift, squat, bench, and even though we do a lot of those, and that makes up a stronger majority of my training than just unstable versions, I'd probably get a quarter of the people looking at my things. My reach, my potential to impact people's lives with what I believe are helpful methods, it would be less. So I do try to tell people that, hey, the unstable versions should never replace the foundational movements. They're added, they're extra. The athlete has to earn the right to be able to do those before we even touch those. I have a lot of athletes come to me the first few months of training. I don't want to say they're disappointed. They're like, dude, when do we get to do the stuff I see you put on Instagram? I'm like, hey man, you got to demonstrate to me that you can do the foundational movements properly first. So that's just kind of my answer there. Now, I would argue too, there are some benefits and with some of the unstable training, like, for example, we just take something like foot and ankle activation, which I think is very underrated and very important. Some of the unstable versions, even if we go as extreme as the Bosu ball, which honestly probably less than 1% of everything I have my athletes do is on the Bosu ball. Okay, but I do periodically use it because I know if they can really learn to activate their feet on there and create a stable platform, even if it's just like one time out of the entire duration that I've worked with this athlete for a few years, if they experience that one time in their mind, even in their nervous system's like, ooh, okay, I see what you're saying. My feet have to activate like crazy in order to stay on there. If they can get that one time, and then we just, hey, that's all it needed, and they can kind of see and get that to transfer into some of their other movements, that's good enough for me. So I do think there is some benefit to stability training, but I do think a lot of coaches overuse it. It's like all this, functional training, functional, instability. It's like, it's all we do. It's like, dude, come on, you got to lift some heavy weights. You got to learn how to pack a punch. Like you said, you got to learn how to produce force. That's the most important thing. All of the biomotor capabilities in physiology are built around the foundation of strength and force production, and there's nothing better than the foundational movement. So I don't disagree with that one bit.
Got it. I totally understand. Yeah, having a big following is important. I have a tiny following and I live alone and I'm addicted to masturbation. So you don't want to go.
Still,
you don't want to go my way. Mike? Hey, Nsima. I see you on the forums. Masturbation addicts.
Hey, I'm not talking about masturbation, homie. It's porn. Masturbation's great, brother. I clarified that. Hey.
Nobody here is yelling at you about it. Stay calm.
I see your forearms, though. I see the forearm games right here.
I don't train my forearms, baby.
I know what you mean, brother.
Yeah, what's with this lighting?
Guys, yeah, isn't it weird? Am I in jail? Am I at a CIA Black Ops facility? And they're like, all right, you can talk for half an hour. Like, guys, I got to get going. I got to run.
We appreciate it.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Am I released?
That was fantastic from both you guys. Most people would be, on both sides, would be kind of unwilling. And I forced this on Joel. So, Joel, you're a savage to be able to take this on without any preparation. Thank you so much for your time today, Mike.
Like I said, Mike, even having talked with you now face to face like this, I have even more respect for you as a professional in the field than I already did, because I saw the way you handled yourself, even just on social media. So it was nice talking with you, and I'm sure our paths will cross again.
Likewise, Joel. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was super awesome and open-minded of you to take on such short notice. Nsima, always a pleasure. Mark, cut that thing off. Jesus Christ, you're going to get arrested.
October 24th, we have a seminar here with Ben Patrick. Both you guys are invited. We'd love to have you guys come check it out.
I'm gonna check my schedule, see what the masturbation stack looks like. Nsima knows what I'm talking about. All right, I'll see you guys later.
Catch you later, Pumpkinhead.
Bye.